Okay, so in this video, I thought we would talk a little bit about lighting and rendering and sort of setting up a studio-looking environment for this. So first, of course, my textures aren't amazing yet, but some of that is just being able to see it rendered, right? So I could create a ground plane here, and if I go to Arnold Render View, it's going to calculate my material, and it's going to try to render it. But currently, I don't think I have any. Currently, I have a sun direction light. I don't even know what that is. Yeah, if I turn it on, you can see I'm getting a little bit of something there, but I think that's just from. I'm actually not sure what that's from, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And instead, we're gonna start putting some of our own lights in here. So I wanted to talk briefly about the 3-point lighting setup. So if you actually just search that 3-point lighting, you're gonna find a lot of examples of what that actually means. But in all of these illustrations, you'll see sort of the same thing. You have a main light that's going to provide the primary source of your light. Right? You have a fill light, which is sort of going to fill in some of that color, or fill in some of those dark areas. And then this backlight is going to sort of add a little bit of a halo around the top of somebody's head. So you can see like you get a little bit of this halo around the top there. Right. So if you're ever curious about the three lights, that's what people are talking about in a 3-point lighting setup. So we could set that up. But what I'm actually just going to do is start putting some lights in here and start seeing what we get. So get a light, and I usually start with an area light. So I maybe will make this my key light. I'm going to scale it up, move it up, and you'll see that mine's pointing in the wrong direction. So I'll point it this way. You want that line to be pointing straight forward. So I'll go ahead and pull this out. And get in here where we can see it. And now when I go back to my Arnold Render View, not getting very much, right? So I can do my exposure. Sometimes I'll uncheck normalize, and that will help a lot. And I'll also turn up my exposure to something like 2, maybe 3, right? And you'll start to see why we need some of this stuff. Like we got a primary light, but we need some area filled in the back here, right? And so we can start building a 3-point lighting setup, or we can light it however we want to. But I want to talk about something different, which is an environment light. Okay, so I'm sorry, image-based lighting. So let's imagine that we are, filming, or we're animating the Hulk for the next Avengers movie, right? And he's bashing through the middle of downtown New York, right? There's very specific lighting situations that are happening because of the environment, right? The sun is in the sky. It's bouncing off of all the different buildings. Some of those buildings are different colors. It's picking up information from all of those areas, right? And to replicate that with just a bunch of area lights or a bunch of point lights or however you want to do it can be really time consuming and hard to get to match accurately. I mean, we can get something that's close, but factoring all of that stuff in, the blue car that's setting across the street that's casting a little bit of blue light onto the side of the Hulk's face, like all of that stuff is really hard to figure out, and it's hard to get it photoreal because of that. Oh, I don't know what just happened there. Sorry. Hopefully, let's see if I'm still recording. I am. Okay. So what is used for this a lot is image-based lighting. So what this means, if you actually search HDRI or IBL, you'll find a lot of this stuff from that. An image-based lighting or an HDRI image is it's a little misleading. Oh, this is not where I wanted to be. This is where I wanted to be. So HDR just means that high dynamic range. It means that if you take a picture with your phone, there's a 0 to 1 range of brightness to darkness, right? But you can adjust your brightness before you take the picture, and then that range is different, right? So what an HDR image is a whole bunch of images of the same thing. Like you just take, instead of taking one picture of, your bedroom, you take 10 of them with different lighting settings, right? And so then instead of having this light range of 0 to 1, you may have a light range of like -5 to +5, right? And so that means you can get some of that information in those really dark shadows that are too dark in some of the brighter images you took, and you can also get some of that information that is washing out in some of those images as well, right? Sorry, I said that backwards, but so that's what an HDR image is. When we talk about image-based lighting, though, this is an HDR image that was taken of a dome, right? And so we can click on some of these. These are just a bunch of free ones that you can use for this. And what it is people have set up in these different locations, and they've taken HDR images, but they've not just taken them of the environment. They've taken them of a um, reflective orb that they've had in the scene, right? So I have a couple. I have a Brooklyn Bridge HDR image here. We can see the preview of what that looks like. Right? Imagine half of this is really the one side of the orb that they took a picture of, or took multiple pictures of, and they unwrapped it to where it fits into this. They've unwrapped that rounded image into a square image. Right? Same here. They did this with the other side, and so what we actually now have is nearly a full 360-degree view of this environment, right? And it's all captured in this one image with multiple iterations of light. Now, this is just a preview of what it looks like. The actual HDR image is this 2K HDR, and it's usually the largest file. This one is showing up as bigger. I'm not necessarily sure why, but it's just a JPEG of the same thing. So that's the file we're going to use as a light. Okay, so let me just show you let me close that. That was from before. Just kind of show you what we're going to do is I'm going to go into. Actually, there's a couple of different ways of doing this. One, we can go to Arnold. And we can go to lights. We can do a sky dome light. What that's going to do is put an entire orb around our scene, right? And if I were to do an Arnold render of that, this is what we're going to get. Okay. I'm not actually sure. I think I got 2 of those for some reason. Yeah, let's do that again. So this is what we're going to get, right? It's light coming from all directions. It's kind of evenly lighting everything, right? But I can select this, and in the color, I can map in that file, that HDR file, right? And if I choose Brooklyn Bridge, this 2K HDR, right, and hit open, so now I can see this all the way around me, right? Like everywhere I look, it's like there's a virtual 3D environment here. And what Arnold is going to do is it's going to take the lighting information from that and project it into our scene and light the scene with that information. So obviously the primary source of light is coming from behind us. I can turn my bottle around, right? And this is actually going to be much more real or accurate to what the lighting actually was in this scene, right? If I were to turn around here and render from that. But the thing you're seeing is, although we're seeing it in our viewport, it's not coming up in our scene here, right? I can still use my attribute editor to adjust the intensity or the exposure, right? I can put this exposure up to 2, and this is going to be much brighter, probably too bright. Put it up to 1. And so we're starting to get some pretty decent renders there. Put my samples up to 5, and it should be a little bit more detailed. All right. And so we're going to get some good, pretty decent lighting automatically that is all coming from this image, right? And the back side of this scene, although it's still blue, like we're getting some of the color that's bouncing from, this green or whatever guardrail rail thing here. But because it's so heavily lit by the sky, you are going to get a lot of blue in this. And even though you can't really see it extremely clearly, we're going to get some things that are in here that are bouncing from other colored things too. Like the bridge just kind of got this orange thing, but it's still predominantly blue. But we're still getting some of that orange light in there. So that's one way we could do this. I'm going to go ahead and delete this. The only problem with that version of it is we weren't actually seeing the image in the background, right? Now there's another way we can do this through our render settings, right? Which is under Arnold Renderer, we have this environment option. And so what we can tell Maya to do is to create a physical sky shader, right? And map, and so it's not really creating an orb, but it's kind of creating this, let me make sure that's the one I wanted to do. Pretty sure it is. Create sky shader. There we go. So it's creating this orb, and it's a little different. It's not really a light. It's just this orb that has the ability to map an image onto it. The physical sky shader will kind of fake a physical, blue sky. So I want to go ahead and map into color that same image again. And when I go to Arnold Render View, so we're still going to get it, but now we're actually getting that image in the background, right? And so I can actually see how this sort of fits into this world now. So there are some things you'll want to work with here under Arnold. Let's see. So we can adjust our intensity here, but we're still going to get a little bit of this grain, right? And so some of that's going to be things that we would change under the sampling in our render settings. So for example, the diffuse, I could turn that up to 5. Probably going to get a little less of that noise, right? If we turn it all the way up to 10, we'd get even less. Maybe the camera. But every time we do this, it's going to raise our render time a little bit as well. So this is just something to recognize that this is how we can sort of clean up some of that speckling in there. Okay. So we have this. Now, whether you actually want to see this environment in the background or not is kind of your choice. I wanted to show you an option of how to make this look a little bit more like a studio environment. We can still use this real world lighting, but I'm going to go ahead and delete this floor plane, and we're going to create a, like a 5, or I guess we'll always see it. I'm going to create an environment in here that's very similar to a studio photography environment. So I'm going to create a polygon plane. Where are we at here? I'm going to start scaling this thing up. And I want this to have a lot of spans in it. So I'm going to go into my channel box under polyplane 1. I'm just going to turn that up to 50. So again, how I do that is highlight the words, middle click out here, and drag that up. It's going to take it up to 50. So I'm just making this a little higher resolution. And then I'm going to scale this thing up pretty big. Right. Now, I can render it like this. Still, yeah, this is still going to work. Now we're just getting this bigger environment, but really, I kind of want it to seem like it's in a void, right? Like it's just in some, strange, empty world that has a background. But that's what studio photography is when we're taking pictures of objects like this. They kind of set them inside of this box that is closed off, and we can control the lighting for it. And so to make that, what we're going to need to do is sort of have a subtle, like slow bend that points this straight up. So we have a deformer that we can use to do that. And we're going to be using deformers a little bit more when we're rigging this thing later. So that's going to be under either rigging or animation. You can find it in both places. Apparently it's also under modeling now. That's cool. So cool. We can find it here, deform. And what we're looking for is this nonlinear bend. Okay. So you're going to see that it's going to put this this object that's just like a line right through the middle of our scene, right? And if I go to my attribute editor or my channel box over here, you'll see that there's this bend 1 input. And if I click that, you'll see this curvature node. And so I can bend that, but it's not bending it because our object doesn't, it's that plane. It doesn't actually have any depth, right? However, if I started to rotate our bend node, you'll see that from the side angle it does, and it bends it like that. So I'll set that to 90, right? And what I'm going to do is rotate it again in my x-axis. So I'll set that to 90 as well. And so this is what we're getting. Now, if we look at this bend node, right? Can I hide this? Just so we can't see it for a second, so it's a little bit clearer. So if we look at this bend node, we have this center point, right? And I can move that, and it's going to change where it's bending the object, right? Or I could move it down, and it's going to do some weird stuff to it. So this is a deformer for this object, and we'll talk a little bit more about the details of it. But the thing to recognize is that there's areas that are deforming below our center point and above it. And so if we go to bend 1, we have this low bound and high bound. And so low bound is apparently going to be that side. I guess I rotated it in the wrong direction, but that's fine. So I'll go ahead and leave my low bound up. I'm going to take my high bound down to 0 though. And what that's going to do is it's just going to stop deforming it on the floor. And so I could render from this now if I wanted to. And, I hid my, where is it at? How in the world did I hide that? It wasn't the image plane. It wasn't the image plane. I didn't delete it. Let me undo until I get that thing back. Sorry. There it is. That's too far. There we go. Take that high bend down. And so that object out there is still casting light. And so we're still going to get that same lighting, but now we're going to get it in this world that seems to just sort of bend off into the blue yonder. And so I can click this button to see my shape, and I'm actually able to get a pretty decent like infinite world render there. Right? It feels like I don't see a seam in the background where the wall and the floor meet. Some people like to have a little bit more of a solid gradation there. And so at this point you could probably scale this thing down and get something a little bit more like this. And you'll see a little bit more of that bend in there now. There we go. So it really just depends on what you're going for. But this will allow us to put our object in a scene or in a world, right? and we can use some real world lighting for this scene to get us something that's going to render pretty nicely without very much work on our part. We just had to create that one light with the right map on it, and we're going to get some pretty decent lighting out of this that's not bad. So okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here, and we'll pick this up in the next class or the next video with rigging. So thanks.